there was a notice on the bulletin board requesting proposals from sculptors to come to Seattle, Washington to do life-size temporary animals on the grounds of the Alaska Yukon exposition. A year later, he went back and brought Bertha back, who was his girlfriend. They were married, and I believe 9 months later,
you were an art student at the university.
Yeah.
Who were some of your teachers there?
Oh, Ambrose Patterson. And that little mosquito of a man who was such a beautiful watercolor, Hill, Raymond Hill. Walter Isaacs was the great influence. He was very short, and he was kind of grubby, and he had a face like a potato, and a great bald head with a little fringe of light hair. And I thought he was a janitor, although I never saw a broom or a mop in his hand. And it wasn't until I was at the beginning of my junior year that I learned that he was head of the department. He inspired me to love art, is what he did. And to see the environment around and to apply it to art. You know, art is all over. I remember he used to nag us, saying, remember, light on dark and dark on light, and that's a marvelous thing.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you met Sydney and when?
Oh, sure, that'd be a pleasure. Max Weinstein was a good friend, and Max fixed me up on a blind date. God, I thought he was gorgeous. I'd never been out with anybody like him. He was intelligent. He was a liberal with a capital L.
So when did you get married? You met him in about 1931.
Yeah, we were married about 19... I can't add or subtract. We were married in about 1943, I believe.
You had a long time courtship then, huh?
Oh, boy.
Boy.
I met them in about 1944. And they were very active politically in the Democratic Party. And Annie had enormous picnics and dinners and would work very hard. Everybody came, all kinds of people. to these picnics and parties on their Medina waterfront. There were always people there who you hadn't met before, who were somebody in the art world or the political world. Very interesting nobodies. Very interesting somebodies. All mixed together. Great food. Great food.
How did you get into buying art? I mean, were you both interested in art? How did that happen?
We went to New York, started going to New York in about 1945, 46. By that time, he was making the business was making a little money, and after that, every time we went to New York, he'd say, well, we've made this much money, this has been profit, and we're gonna take this much and buy art with it. Isn't that wonderful?
That's great.
I had a list that was important to me, made out from Art News or New York Times, and Stieglitz number 21 was at the top of the list. So the first thing, I went off in the morning and I found his little gallery, and I opened up the door a little bit, and here I saw this little man sitting on a high stool in the background against the wall, and he had on his little flat brimmed hat like a little Spanish matador, and a garment around his shoulders to keep his little old 100-year-old bones warm. And on his lap was a brown bag of lunch. And when I saw that, I didn't want to intrude, but he just wildly beckoned me to come in. And I did, and he talked at me for almost an hour about all the people in his stable. And I just sat there listening. And I didn't have anything to say, but I didn't have to because he did all the talking. It was just marvelous. He was very small. He was built like a little hummingbird. And of course, I've been reading about his gallery and an importance in photography for a long time. So, and I was so impressionable. I just drank everything.
While you were buying, what would we say, contemporary 20th century art, were you simultaneously collecting the North Coast Indian art, or did you kind of do your collections one at a time?
That the Indian collection happened as a result of sailing the Inside Passage, and that didn't start for 5 or 6 years after we started buying art. One Saturday afternoon, we had to hold over, and we couldn't tie up there in the bay at Alert Bay because it was unprotected, and we just bang all night.
Yeah.
And so we pulled up and went around Cormorant Island into a bunch of little islands. And then all of a sudden I looked up and I saw the forest and a sea of totems beyond. And I began to feel so uncomfortable because no one came out to say hello. And I said to Sydney, we should go. We're not welcome here. And he said to me, we're going to stay until we have friends here. There was a carver that lived in the village by the name of Smith. And he had a totem that they had just put up in the corner of their new house, of their new longhouse, that had been ordered by a yachtsman from Seattle who didn't pick it up, and the man stayed home from fishing for a whole season, so it was a dreadful thing. And so then we bought it. That's now in the garden of the Indian Center out at Fort Lauderdale.
Daybreak Star. So, Anne, what was this early art scene like in Seattle when, you were with Sid and collecting art?
Zoda Zan was a dominant here, for she'd lived a number of years in Paris with a lot of American expatriates. And then after she established her gallery, she began to handle local artists like Horiuchi and Guy Anderson and
The Mystics, the Northwest Mystics.
all the mystics.
So the gallery was in her own
It
home.
was her own home, yeah. And she'd have these nice openings at her house. And we started we had a Guy Anderson. What else did we have? Then
Mark Tobey.
Yeah, we had 2 Mark Tobeys. We had one big one that we never liked.
Well, did you meet a lot of these artists, and did you have like a personal contact with, say, Mark Tobey and
Oh, not very
Guy
much.
Anderson?
Once we went to, we were invited to dinner at the Weinstein's house, and Mark Tobey was already there, and he saw us come up and he had a big scowl on his face and he ran into the dining room and he counted the plates and he went up to Florence Weinstein. He said, "How dare you invite other people?"
He wanted to be the only guest?
He had his friend and he was an imposition for her to ask anyone else. And then we sat down to dinner and gradually thawed out. And he got, toward the end of the dinner, he was extremely charming. I'll never forget that. What a chutzpah.
Sunday, May 16th, 1965. And on Monday, I heard this on the radio that Sid's plane was missing with Wing Luke. And Kayla Du was tough. Real tough. And I think, I was young and I thought that couldn't happen to Sidney because he was too capable.
How has she changed since Sid's death? Or has she?
She hasn't changed. She's just a little freer. She missed him terribly. But she made up her mind she was going to enjoy the rest of her life, and nothing much has stood in the way of that.
He was a bigger-than-life persona, and I always lived in the shadow. So when he was not around, I could develop myself. So I recognized what happened. It was sort of peculiar for a while after I began to bloom. But I feel that if he's watching, that he feels okay about it.
One aspect of Anne that I think sets her apart from other arts patrons in the community, and probably even beyond this community, kind of new and coming up. She isn't locked into an art period. She's very experimental, very willing to take chances.
She was extremely generous to many of the younger artists, including myself, who at that time was a bit of an outcast because I was part of Dr. Fuller's world, or the museum world. And I was invited to her home to meet people, as were numbers of the other younger people. And it was very exciting to watch her move from a very traditional, almost traditional artistic background or visual background or background in the contemporary world to a very, very contemporary world.
She gave me lots of support by purchasing things, collecting things, and also telling other people about my gallery. And in those days, you got lots of mention of the gallery anyway, because there were only a handful of galleries in town. It's not like now there's 375. I mean, back then there were 4 or something, you know. So, but she spread the word around and introduced me to lots of people and invited me to this and that. And I met lots of important collectors through her.
There were an awful lot of artists who, after we closed, went on to show in more established galleries like Linda Ferris, Greg Casera, Traver Sutton. A lot of them were very seminal at the time, and nobody else would have given them a chance. It wasn't within their price structure or their clientele to do that at that time.
And I remember Anne buying a piece that she may not even remember, but for us it was a fairly substantial sale, and the fact that it was by a collector of Anne's stature really added a lot of credibility to the gallery. And it wasn't long before other more established collectors were buying work from us.
What we were doing was absolutely as important as a show of a major Seattle artist who was of the group that had come from Seattle. I'll use a name here, as a Toby, as such. It was all as important. And so we were always able, through Anne, to cross through any kind of the barriers that might have existed, which most of us were very, very interested in crossing then, both in artistic realms, and particularly media at the time. She was one of the first to understand the strength of what video was going to do, was terribly interested in documentation. Totally accepted the idea that a piece of art would be a documented work, that she didn't have to have the work sitting in her living room, that it existed from a photograph or from someone telling her that there had been something done in the desert. She totally accepted that kind of thing, and probably would go see it sometime or another too. Where it may not even have to have been seen, she probably would have seen it. But at no time did she cease seeing a show of Japanese art that might be a part of the cultural fabric of the city, or of any of these kind of things. As I say, she was possibly the bridge, but she saw no gap to bridge. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about her.
She had a lot to do with this exhibit that was called 557,087, which was named so because that was the population of Seattle in the previous census, and she had a lot of impact on what went on. If for no other reason than that particular show, the conceptual art exhibit, because it was kind of introducing a totally new thing that these days there's everybody thinks they got to do something new every 3 weeks, and so there's always something new going on. But that was really out there.
557087 was a complete dud, except that every day 2 or 3 young people called me to say thanks. And the art in public now is a natural result of 557087 in conceptual art.
Ann, can you tell us a little bit about the Ann Gerber Fund, which is at the Seattle Art Museum, and what it's for?
2 people originated the idea. That was Helen Gurvich and Park Sanderson, and they nagged the museum for 1.5 to 2 years until finally they did it.
You might explain a little bit about how it's supposed to work. The endowment will give interest, and that money will be spent on a certain kind of art, right?
The interest of the money was to be spent for a project every other year of the kind of art, again, that the museum wouldn't buy.
So it's basically about avant-garde contemporary art, hopefully with a conceptual bent to it.
Yes. Yes.